So, good evening, everybody. My name is Colleen Winn, and I'm the staff assistant at the African American Resource Center. I would like to welcome you to the Race, Solidarity, and Allyship program. This past year has been eventful, to say the least. The summer of 2020, we as a country were bombarded with a full array of health and racial injustices, and we came to understand the full impact these injustices had on each of us. These injustices rocked us individually and also collectively to the core. We could no longer turn a deaf ear or a blind eye and do what we have done, bury our head in the sand with a short-term memories that does not allow for long-term solutions. No, to survive and thrive as a civilized world, these injustices needed to be redressed. So we as a people on a micro and macro level, we have a commitment to finding solutions to injustices that plague and weaken us as a community. When I was provided the opportunity to come up with a topic for a future AARC program, I thought about the importance of having allies in our workplace and in our communities. I had heard Erin Cross, the director of the LGBT Center, briefly talk about an allyship program she was a part of here on Penn's campus. So what did I do? I reached out to her to see if she would work with me in developing a program that will address the importance of allyship. What was developed out of this collaboration is the program we have here today. So again, I welcome you, and I know you will hear some life-altering information because there is a certain strength that comes from the awareness that we are not in this struggle alone. So without further ado, I will turn the program over to the Associate Director of the African American Resource Center, Darren Toliver.
Colleen Winn, thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I want to say, let me first welcome each and every one of you for joining us this evening as we continue to examine the intricacies of social injustice and its impact on Blacks throughout American history. Social justice issues connected with voting and policing, healthcare, and labor laws occurs in relation to almost every aspect of society where inequality can arise as a result of injustices, prejudice, or policies. Even today, the issue around race and policing continues to rear its ugly head, from Rodney King in 1991 to Trayvon Martin in 2012, and George Floyd and Walter Wallace Jr. just last year. The hallmarks of American democracy, opportunity, freedom, and prosperity have been largely reserved for white people through the intentional exclusion and oppression of people of color. Moreover, the tenets of structural racism continue to disproportionately segregate communities of color from access to opportunity and upward mobility by making it more difficult to secure quality education, jobs, housing, healthcare, and equal treatment in the criminal justice system. Clearly, the glass ceiling still exists, and the lack of balance is more visible than ever. And in 2021, America is being forced to reconcile the past along with the present. Outrage over racial profiling and the killing of African Americans by police officers have recently resurfaced following the death of George Floyd, and most recently, Dwayne Wright last week, a young Black male who was accidentally killed by police during a routine traffic stop. In terms of healthcare, let's remind ourselves that while we are in the midst of a global pandemic, COVID-19, racial disparities regarding testing and vaccination still exist. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that COVID-19 case and hospital rates are at least 2 to 4 times higher among Black, Hispanic, and Native American populations than among white populations. Blacks have died from COVID-19 at more than twice the rate as white individuals. For Blacks, we are faced with the 2 pandemics, COVID-19 and racism. Politics also has revealed long-standing racial stereotypes and prejudices. A recent act by the state of Georgia to suppress the vote, the Black vote, with a new policy that many are looked at and believe that are discriminatory is one example. Former President Donald Trump, who articulated his position with the slogan, "Make America Great Again," also enabled emblem of hate and racial animosity. We are living in an epicenter of a racial reckoning. We are a country divided, clearly. So what can we do? What's next? As my colleague Colleen alluded to earlier, this program came to fruition by way of a general conversation. And for myself and others as social work practitioners, we know that communication and engagement are essential ingredients necessary for the change process to occur. So with that, this is why we're here today, working collaboratively to deconstruct negative perceptions and find solutions. Now is the time to develop new learning alliances, ways to show up, and opportunities to grow and support racial justice and social movements. It starts this evening. It starts right now with this conversation. Joining us will be Malik Muhammad as the facilitator of this program. Malik Muhammad is the Associate Director at the LGBT Center here at Penn. He's a Philadelphia native. Malik holds a bachelor's degree in psychology as well as a master's degree in higher education counseling and student affairs from Westchester University of Pennsylvania. A proud brother of Pennsylvania Town Chapter of Sigma Phi Epsilon fraternity, Malik's passion for social justice began at an early age as the son and grandson of phenomenal change agents in the Philadelphia African-American Muslim community. That passion was reignited and started to flourish during his 6-year academic and paraprofessional career at Westchester. There, he came to realize the deep significance of LGBTQ plus advocacy, education, and working with an intersectional lens at the higher education level and in all walks of life. And now, years later, Malik himself is a true change agent. At Penn, he diligently works to support students, faculty, staff, alumni, and community members, spearheading the center's educational programs, advising LGBTQ plus student groups, and fostering collaboration among the university with various other roles. Malik also serves as the Philadelphia community, as a member of the Penn Center for AIDS Research, the Community Advisory Board, the Colors Organization Board, and just as a talented local artist and entertainer. With that being said, with that great introduction, I want to bring on Malik.
Thank you so much, Darren. I greatly, greatly appreciate that amazing introduction, one of me, but also of our overall programming. Thank you, Colleen, for your introduction as well. I'm truly, truly honored to be here today to jump into a much needed conversation. And I, again, am so excited because we are truly taking the effort to recognize and understand that the University of Pennsylvania is not immune to the symptoms of racism and discrimination that we see within our nation and in our world today. And we are honored to be here today to really discuss how we as a Penn community can really continue to address so many of the issues we see in our world today. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. First up, we have Dr. Valerie Dorsey Allen. Dr. Allen is a 2010 graduate of the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, SP2, and the Doctorate of Clinical Social Work program. Her dissertation, entitled Educational Entertainment as an Intervention for Adolescents Exposed to Community Violence, is published online at ProQuest and Scholarly Commons. She has co-written articles with Dr. Phyllis Solomon on the same topic for the multiple peer-reviewed journals. They also have a chapter in a textbook entitled Police and the Unarmed Black Male Crisis. Currently, the director of the University of Pennsylvania's African American Resource Center, Dr. Allen is focused on addressing the needs and interests of the Penn community and on improving the quality of life for faculty, staff, and students with a particular focus on those of African descent. Additionally, she has been a lecturer at SP2 and at Rutgers University School of Social Work. She has been a field practice supervisor for Penn and Temple University graduate social work students. In addition, Dr. Allen serves as the president emerita of the Association of Black Women in Higher Education, as a Center for Public Health Initiatives Fellow, and is an associate of the Philadelphia Collaborative Violence Prevention Coalition. She believes, as Dr. King said, that everyone can be great because anybody can serve. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Allen, or as we like to call you, Val. Next up, we have Elizabeth Cannon. Elizabeth currently serves as the Senior Associate Director at Civic House, Penn's hub for social justice education and community engagement. Among her responsibilities at Civic House, Elizabeth facilitates social justice workshops around issues of identity, privilege, power, oppression, and responsible community engagement. She works to build long-term sustainable relationships with community organizations by centering and valuing their voices in the process. Before coming to Penn, Elizabeth previously served as an associate director of WECARE, the Ursinus Center for Advocacy, Responsibility, and Engagement at Ursinus College in Collegeville, PA, helping to coordinate the Ursinus's PA Scholars in Service Program and the Bonner Leader Program. Elizabeth graduated from Ursinus College with a self-designed major in social ecology and received her master's degree in higher education from Penn's Graduate School of Education. Currently, Elizabeth is pursuing her doctorate in higher education from Penn GSC with research interests that focus on critical feminism and community engagement, shifting power dynamics between institutions and community voice. In the broader community, Elizabeth proudly serves on the executive board of the Victim Services Center of Montgomery County in Norristown. And today, Elizabeth is joining us as one of the co-founders of WECARE, Whites Enforcing Community and Against Racism in Education. So excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today, Elizabeth. So excited to have you with us as well. Today, we are really focusing a little bit on how we as Black and white folks can show up in supporting our Black communities, and how can white allies really stand up in solidarity with folks in our Black communities, and especially here at Penn and at the broader campus community. So we really want to dig right into the questions, because we've done a lot of introductions in getting us into our conversation today. So let's just jump right in with our first question for today. What are the differences and/or similarities between being an ally, an accomplice, and an anti-racist? And, you know, it's really important because this language is being tossed around a lot. So we would love if you could give us kind of a contextual way of how we think about allyship, accompliship, and being an anti-racist.
So I guess I'll start. And so I grew up in a house with a picture on our wall of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Eldridge Cleaver, who was the leader of the Black Panther Party, one of the leaders. And I was always drawn to this picture of these very different but strong Black men. And so I often look to those three for some direction. And so one of the things that, as I was preparing for this, that I did was I looked at what they had to say about allies and how they used or didn't use them. And so Martin Luther King, of course, said, "We do not need allies who are more devoted to order than to justice." And he also wrote, "I hear a lot of talk these days about our direct action programs alienating former friends. I would rather feel they are bringing to the surface more latent prejudice, which were always there." And so one of the things, you know, as I think about that, you know, we always hear, and he at that was also talking that time about people telling him to wait. And who were the allies around him that were saying, no, it's time, we need to move forward and we need to help you move forward. And Malcolm X said, where the really sincere white people have got to do their proving of themselves is not among the Black victims, but out on the battle lines of where America's racism really is, and that's in their home communities. America's racism is among their own fellow whites. That's where sincere whites who really mean to accomplish something have got to work. And so that's what I think about allies. That's what we need allies to do. So it's great to have them support us and say, yeah, we agree with what you're saying. We know that you're right. We know that these things are happening. But what we need allies to be and to do are to go to their communities, to go to other white people, similar to the way WECARE is doing, and talk to them and amongst themselves and say, we know this is happening and we need to do something about it. And Eldridge Cleaver said, there is no more neutrality in the world. You either have to be part of the solution or you're going to be part of the problem. And I'm glad that I'm in a place, and I'm talking about Penn, and in this space with us, where not only are we allowed, but we're encouraged to develop allyship relationships and to work across difference to build together. And so what I see an ally is that person who comes from, who is white in this case, because we're talking about the Black-white binary, who is going to acknowledge what is happening, not only to me, but to their white colleagues, their white family members, and their white friends, and say, we've got to make changes, and here is where it's happening. Is that enough?
Is that enough? Of course it's enough. You know what, you really contextualized that in a really beautiful way. I want to toss it over to Elizabeth with any response that you may have.
Yeah, that was definitely enough. That was great. Well, I would say, in response to that, I feel really humbled to be sitting and having this conversation with you. I think it's also important to note that I'm here because I'm committed to racial justice and dismantling systems of white supremacy, both within myself and the broader world. I do not have all the answers about whiteness and white privilege and understanding white supremacy. And I think on my own anti-racist journey, I've come to learn that it has to come from a place of humility and listening and learning, and that it's a constant process of unlearning and relearning how I want to show up in the world. And so I want to start by saying that. I think it's a really good question. I think it's complicated, the differences or similarities between an ally and accomplice in being anti-racist. I think that for a really long time, being an ally was considered a compliment. And I think specifically in the context of racial justice, white allyship was like the aspirational status. It was like this badge of honor that white people wanted to hold. And I think as there's been some collective consciousness raising for white people recently around the racial injustices that Black, Indigenous people of color experience, I think allyship is no longer enough. I think that being part of the solution and not part of the problem is what's really important. And I think the challenge to allyship in my mind, the way that white people come to it, is it's somebody who supports equal justice in theory, right? It's often the thoughts and the prayers, or maybe it's talking in small groups among other white people and challenging overtly racist things. And while I think it's great that white people are starting to show up and support people of color, I think we need to do more. I think we can just no longer just be allies. I think part of the work is about advancing further in dismantling white supremacy at institutional levels, organizational levels, interpersonal levels, internalized levels. And I think allyship for a lot of white people, because we hold it up as this badge of honor, isn't about justice and liberation. Whereas I think like the accomplice to me feels different. It feels like an accomplice is trying to actively dismantle systems of oppression. And maybe they've gone through the initial phases of allyship and trying to understand, you know, their roles, our roles as white people in upholding white supremacy, white privilege, and unjust structures. But I think accomplices flip the dynamic and use what they've learned or whatever access they have to disrupt and challenge racial injustices, whether it's at institutional levels, thinking about challenging policies that support mass incarceration, that disproportionately affects Black people and people of color, or at organizational levels around tokenism or the unpaid labor. I mean, you know, thinking about faculty and staff of color that they take on, and even interpersonal levels of like policing, tone policing, or microaggressions. And so I think accomplices really tap into their privilege in the service of justice and supporting those most impacted by racism. And it's not an identity, it's a practice that's based on building relationships of trust and doing it consistently, and where there's accountability.
I think that I really agree with you. And one of the other things I think that it has changed over the years, because I think initially that's what allies did. And so I like the word accomplice. You know, I'm a wordy, so, you know, I know that comes from a Latin root that means to come together. And that's the thing other thing I like about the word accomplice, because it, by virtue of its meaning, it means that you're coming together in the fight with the people that are fighting. And so I think at this point in our span of time, one of the major differences between an accomplice and an ally is that the accomplice is ready to go to battle. You know, it's not just saying, you know, I agree, I support, but they're ready to dismantle the structures that oppress us. I really like that word.
Yeah, and I actually saw in the chat that Charisse put co-conspirator, which I also think is really aligned with accomplice, and that was language that I think Alicia Garza initially had talked about. And I think that's like, yeah, I mean, I think language, while it's not everything, I do think it can be important.
I do.
Yeah, you both have done such a beautiful job of contextualizing how we think about this. And as you said, Elizabeth, language is so important, right? It's not everything, but it is important because it is somewhat of the driving force behind how we jump on board. And I love this notion, Valerie, that you mentioned of proving of themselves in their home communities, right? In their own communities, making sure that they are willing to do that work and making the effort to build together. And Elizabeth, you brought forward this notion of humility, right? White folks need to come from a place of humility and recognize that it is a constant process, that is not just going to happen overnight. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I do want to take a moment and make sure I acknowledge the name of this organization appropriately, because it is a newer organization. I want to make sure I say it right. WECARE are the White Educators Committed to Anti-Racism and Equity, right? It is a phenomenal organization that is moving us forward here at Penn. So I wanted to make sure I got that right. And also, as we are speaking here today, there may be moments where you're like, oh, that spawned a question for me. Feel free to put any questions that you may have in the Q&A. We will definitely have a Q&A portion towards the end. So as folks are speaking, if you have any questions or thoughts that may pop up for you, feel free to put them right into the Q&A section there. Continuing on with our panelists here, let's jump into our next question. Is there a difference between allyship and solidarity? And if so, what does white allyship look like at Penn? And what are the fears and risks that may be associated with being an ally? What do you got?
I'll let you go first on this one, Elizabeth.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, so Kim Tran, who is facilitates and does research around the intersections of race and gender. She's an Asian American woman who talks about standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. She's recently writing a book that's actually the title or the manuscript is The End of Allyship, a new era of solidarity.
Mm.
So I encourage us all to look at that. I think she's phenomenal. But I think, to me, solidarity speaks more to the co-conspirator piece. That I think solidarity is really rooted in collaboration, humility, accountability. Whereas I think that's important in racial justice, because I think whiteness demands a preservation of self, individualism, and power. And I think someone who works in solidarity is really working alongside communities that they support, and they seek and create meaningful relationships with the people they actively are trying to support. And so for me, I think solidarity means showing up with, and not just for, Black people or people of color, and really listening. I think solidarity is not about co-opting a cause or centering ourselves, which I think oftentimes we as white people do a lot, is center ourselves in racial justice movements. But I think it's really about being conscious of our privilege and using it to shift power. I think really true solidarity is about action towards like a collective upheaval, and overhaul of every system we have. And it's really understanding where do we stand in relation to systems of privilege and oppression, and unlearning the habits and practices that protect those systems. And it's really asking, how can we show up for people who have been most marginalized and leverage our privilege in the fight for freedom and liberation? I think what also stands apart for me in the solidarity versus allyship is like the willingness to put yourself on the line. Like, what am I really truly willing to give up? Whether it's assets, reputation, time, connections, resources. Like, I think solidarity means like having skin in the game. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there for a second.
I agree with everything you said, and it's not really a whole lot to add to that. I think that one of the things that being in solidarity is a more accountable position than others, because you're right, it does involve putting skin in the game. It means that you're addressing issues alongside of those who are being marginalized, and it is less paternalistic than sometimes. I think that sometimes people want to kind of take over and do for, as opposed to do with, or they want to stand behind and support from the back. And so when you're in solidarity, you're right here with me. It's like in my mind, I picture John Lewis and others coming across the Selma Bridge, linked arms with each other. They were moving in solidarity, you know? And so, and you're right, it does involve saying, you know, although I might have this privilege, you know, I'm gonna have to put this privilege aside so that I can be together with those who are marginalized. And it is my opinion that if you are in that privileged group, that you should be striving to achieve solidarity. And, you know, we can do that together, you know?
Yes, y'all are hitting the nail on the head in so many different ways. And the language that is coming out of this conversation, I'm just so impressed with. You, Elizabeth, you said the collective upheaval. I say yes, the collective upheaval of and how we dismantle white supremacy on all levels, right? And that willingness to stand with and decenter whiteness, right? Because too often white folks are bringing themselves forward in a way that makes it all about them. And that is not what solidarity looks like. So important. I wonder if either of you might be able to address a little bit of what are some of those fears and risks of being an ally? And I think you started to touch on this a little bit, Elizabeth, right? In terms of being willing to leverage your privilege while also sacrificing a piece of it. So I wonder if y'all have any thoughts on that.
Do you want to go?
You know, some of the tangible risks or that it was funny because I read this article and it was about an athlete. And right now I can't remember who it was. And it was a Black athlete who was speaking. And she said that during the time when athletes were taking a knee, one of her white colleagues took a knee. And she was so proud that she did that. But she didn't feel that she could take a knee because she felt that the consequences for her would be a lot harsher than they would be for her white colleague. One of the risks that happens is that her the white colleague that took the knee could have lost position, could have been seen as a troublemaker or a trouble starter. And we know that it's a good thing sometimes to be a troublemaker, as John Lewis has told us. And so that's one of the tangible risks, that you could be seen as a troublemaker, that you could be seen as someone who is just wanting to, I was trying to think of the word that I'm looking for, and I think that it's kind of pandering to what's happening, what's popular, what's common. And so I think that that's, a big risk that you have to be willing to take. There's also a risk of rejection. That's just not, it's not necessary that people are going to accept what you're doing. And now you've put yourself in a position to be standing out in the crowd, So that's a big risk. And, here's another part of it that I don't think we think about often, because I think when we think about risks of allies and accomplices, we think about the risk in their own community, but there's also some risk coming into the Black community, because we may look at them as they might just be a spy, they might not be sincere in what they're doing. And so that's a risk to step in there and put yourself out in that way and not knowing how you're going to be received.
Yeah, you bring up this essence of trust, right? And where is that level of trust? But then also the willingness to rock the boat, right? That's what I kept thinking about as you were talking about, is having that putting yourself in a position where you are rocking the boat and making good trouble.
Yes.
Because clearly trouble needs to be had. But I think you've also provided a nice little segue into our next question. And that is, how can we move beyond bumper sticker activism or social media activism that feels passive or is not really taking that next step? So how do we move beyond that notion of bumper sticker activism?
And you keep looking at me. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, wake up to what's going on. I think for white people, challenging our own complicity and upholding and maintaining white supremacy. And I say white supremacy, and I want to clarify that, like, I'm not talking about just like far right extremists or neo-Nazis. Like, I'm talking about how it's woven into every aspect of our society. And I think part of moving beyond like the bumper sticker activism too is like not distancing ourselves from other white people, but really trying to interrogate the privilege that we have. I think the activism piece to me is about the actions that we have in our lives and also as part of movements and organizations that are in pursuit of equity, liberation, inclusion, and justice. At Civic House, I've used this framework called My Role in a Social Change Ecosystem that Deepa Iyer wrote, and it talks about these different types of roles: the disruptor, the bridge builder, the healer, the frontline responder. And I think it's like a really helpful framework to think about activism, and even moving beyond bumper sticker activism. It's more than just showing up to a protest one time and carrying a sign. I think there's so many ways to move beyond bumper sticker activism in the struggle for racial justice. And I think a lot of that has to be rooted in the needs and interests and wants of those most effective. And I think it goes back to some of what we were talking about along solidarity. It requires accountability. It requires partnership, ensuring that the action you are taking has not only been vetted by the community you're supporting, but also that it works in concert with the work that they're already doing. And I think, yeah, I mean, it goes back to the, like, what am I willing to give up? You know, taking responsibility for, you know, for white people, for our own anti-racist education, instead of asking the BIPOC community to do it for us. I think it is talking to, you know, our white friends and family members. I think it's caring more about acting in allyship and solidarity versus like trying to signal that to other people. And I also think that part of moving beyond bumper sticker activism is like addressing harm when it happens and it arises, whether it came from you or not. And then I think there's like larger, you know, what can I do as a white person to move beyond bumper sticker activism? And I think people published articles left and right, you know, this year especially, but like, I think recognizing the ways capitalism was built on slavery and racism is intertwined with economic oppression, supporting POC-owned businesses because economic exploitation is one of the cornerstones of racial oppression, giving money to organizations working to fight racial oppression and support communities of color, supporting increasing the minimum wage, because we can't ignore the fact that a large proportion of people of color work in lower paid jobs, advocate for defunding the police and abolishing the prison industrial complex, because that includes the school to prison pipeline and reinvesting funds back into Black communities. And I think like those are all, you know, we could go on a list about ways.
Yeah, there are tons of ways. And so, you know, as I think about this, Malik, one of the things that you often say is that Black people are not monolithic and neither are white people, right? So just like there are as many versions of us as there are stars in the sky, there are as many versions of ways to move beyond bumper sticker activism. I got this text message from one of my friends, and it said, issues of racism and white supremacy won't get addressed and end until white people see it as an issue that they need to solve rather than a Black issue that they need to empathize with. So how do you move beyond bumper sticker? Don't empathize with us. Solve the issue, right? So I have, in my role at the African American Resource Center, we see clients. And I had a client who came to see me that was having problems in his department. And he felt that they were race related. So he let his managers know, and they said, okay, we're going to hold a series of conversations about issues of race. And so they planned these sessions, but they planned them for after work hours, and attendance was optional. Therefore, attendance was low and management was not there. So if you're in that department and you want to be an ally or you want to be an accomplice, then you need to be talking to management and saying, we need to have these sessions at times when people are going to come. Management, you need to show up at these sessions because we know if the director and vice president and other people in authority are in these meetings, other people are going to go just so they could say they were there. You know, if you are an ally and accomplice, because what I suggested to this person was take somebody with you to the meeting with your supervisor, take one of your white colleagues, because the thing is that, again, it has to be an issue that white people see that needs to be solved rather than something that we just need to talk about and empathize with. So you can write letters and all the things that you said, you can do anything, correct mistakes as they happen. You know, and I think one of the things, and you said, I think you said this earlier, was that, you know, nobody knows it all. So sometimes there are going to be mistakes that happen. Acknowledge it. so that you can grow from it and move on. But there are many ways to move from bumper sticker. I don't want another person to, not that I don't want people to tell me, oh, I just hate that that happened. I feel so bad, because I need some action. I need something done. And that's, you know, at this point, it's like, if I hear about, well, I'm not going to say this because I know that eventually we will hear another incident of police and shootings, but we got to do something about it. We can't just keep saying this can't happen, because obviously it can, because obviously it does.
Yes, we have to go beyond being complicit.
Yeah.
Right? And just seeing it as this is the way things are. The way things are is a problem that needs to be addressed. And yes, I'm all here for the empathy, but we need to move beyond just being empathetic and really putting some things into action, right?
And, you know, just let me just add to that. I think it's real important that we understand that, because psychologists have found that when Black people speak out against something that's racist, they're seen as rude, or they're seen as angry, or they're seen as self-serving. But when white people do it, they're perceived as persuasive, okay? When Black people push for diversity, they seem as self-interested. But when white people do it, they're seen as objective. And so we have to use those things. Those are ways that you can move from bumper sticker to really be an activist. Use your privilege in that way to help us move beyond some of the white supremacist notions that we live under.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think, like, you know, I think in hearing that, I also want to like uplift again the fact that it's like not about doing it perfectly.
Right.
It's about growing, apologizing, repairing, and continuously trying to like be better and do better.
Be better and do better. Yes, yes. It's that action piece. The action piece is what has been missing for far too long. And we're encouraging folks to find your lane. In today's day and age, there are so many lanes and ways to be an activist. Find your lane. Find your lane, maybe find multiple lanes, you know, find what you need and what works for you and how you can continue to contribute to our communities. So this next question, I do want to preface this because as Val said, I like to say, we are not a monolith. And no one person can speak for the entire Black community, and no one person can speak for the entire white community. But I want to pose this question as a way of what you all, based on the expertise and the experiences that you have had, what do Black people need white people to do? That's a loaded question. That's a loaded one, but we got to think about it, right? What do Black people need white people to do? And how can Black people assist our allies, and what are our needs? What do we got?
So I'll take this. I don't know if people on here watch Queen Sugar. It's one of the shows that I watch, and I just think it is so well written and so well done. Plus, it has a lot of good-looking men, but that's a whole nother story. This current season is phenomenal because what they did was they are taking what happened in 2020, and every show covers a period. So recently they got to the murder of, Lord have mercy, Floyd. Why can't I think of his first name? That's a shame. George, thank you.
George, yes.
They just are dealing with that. And so one of the characters, one of the Black female characters is asked by a young white character, how can I be a better ally? I rewound and watched that a few times because I said, this is perfect. I'm behind on the show. So it just happened to come on this week. And I said, oh, I need to remember this. And what she said was, never think you know it all. Be uncomfortable. Stay uncomfortable. Stay asking questions. Stay listening. Stay trying. That's how to be a better ally. Don't not do anything because you're afraid of making a mistake. And the other side of that is, as Black people, we have to know that mistakes are going to be made. And you got to look sometimes to a person's heart, and you have to, and be able to say, you said that, and I know that's not really, that didn't come across quite the way you wanted it to. Let me help you find a better way to say that. Let me help you find a better way to assist so that you can help our allies to not continue to make mistakes. But on the other side of mistakes, there's a lot of learning. I think the other thing that we need is for our allies and other people to recognize that white oppression and prejudice has taken place in multiple communities. But the experience of Blacks in America is unique and different than any other. We were brought here as chattel, and even after slavery was abolished, continued to be enslaved, literally and figuratively, by plantation owners, by slave patrollers, which then became police, by Jim Crow laws. And while the laws have changed, if you think about it, it's been less than 60 years since the Civil Rights Movement. I was alive when the Civil Rights Movement was passed, right? And we're still fighting some of those battles. And so when, there's a great GIF that has the difference between equality and equity, and it shows three people standing on a box at three different heights, and they're looking over a fence, but you see, I don't know if you can see this, but one is here, and one is here, and the only one that can see over the fence is the one that's here. But when you do equity, you increase the size of the boxes that they're standing on so that everybody can look over the fence. And so we have to remember that at this point, there is not equity. We are so far behind in some of you think about land ownership, you think about generational wealth, you think about educational systems, you think about the new Jim Crow with the prison system. All of those things have to be acknowledged and addressed. And we really need for white people to do that, to acknowledge that. And so sometimes when we talk about diversity programs, and we're talking about white and Black, the white-Black binary, people want to throw other things in. And a lot of times the Black part will get lost in the background. That's one of the things that is important with the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's about Black lives. It's not saying that no other lives matter, but we got to keep this focus on us, because if we don't, it will surely get pushed back under the rug. Oh, okay.
Yes, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. Breathe on that one. Yes. Elizabeth, I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question, but I do have some thoughts. I mean, I think a lot of what Valerie just said, I think part of white people's work has to be educating themselves about systemic racism and white supremacy, because they're at the root of the US's foundation and history. And I think, to me, I think about like white people's engagement in anti-racism as both, like, as two pieces. Well, it's lifelong, but the two pieces I think about are that it's healing work and it's consciousness raising, because I think it has to, for white people, involve both the heart and the head. I think the healing work, because it is deeply personal, and because racism and oppression, like, there's a collective trauma that we've felt. It's dehumanizing. It creates structures devoid of like deep and real empathy. It creates disconnection, dispossession, and I think like radical love is really needed to create true racial justice, but that includes daily and intentional and informed action to really examine, for us as white people, our biases, our prejudices, the ways we've ingested an overvaluing of whiteness in our nation. And I think that that manifests in internalized white dominance, which might hit hard for some white people listening, but I think it really takes some healing work to explore what does that mean for us individually. How can we interrogate our worldviews to form a more constructive white identity? It's messy and it's hard, but I do think that's part of the heart work, is that it really takes a true commitment from us to reckon with, repair, and try to rebuild something that doesn't see whiteness as the norm and or overvaluing it. But then I think it's the consciousness raising too, as the head of like really understanding how the history of racism impacted people of color in history, but like currently today. And I think Valerie explained, the ways that it is impacting people today.
Yes, so eloquently and passionately. I really appreciate that. And it's because I say that as someone that is in the millennial generation, right? And for me personally, history for a very long time was something I was like, I'm over it. I don't want to hear about this. It's not something that I'm interested in. But we cannot think about where we are today without acknowledging where we were, right? And the historical context of how we've gotten to where we are today, and being able to acknowledge the trickling impacts that so much of what you've talked about, Dr. Allen, that has impacted where we are and how we engage in our world today. We have to really do that critical look, that interrogation of the history and how we repair so much of that harm. And that's why we're ready to step forward. And I really also appreciate you, Dr. Allen, bringing forward this notion of being able to focus on Black lives, right? Because we see injustices in all different types of ways in our country today. But it's important that we don't always try to equate them and overlap them and allow them to, one, yes, intersectionality is important, right? And think about how the nuances may come into play. But really, the time is now to pay that close attention to the Black lived experience, especially here in America. Yes. So we want to shift gears just slightly, and think about, because we've been talking about it in the historical context. We want to bring it to the personal, right? So we have a question. How do you challenge your own personal prejudices and biases that folks may hold? How might we encourage our participants here today to challenge themselves?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to be willing to admit that we do in fact have biases. And that's all of us. And you have to make yourself aware of what they are. So one of the things, I mean, if you can't figure it out on your own, there are tests you can take that are implicit bias tests that you can kind of take and kind of see where you fall in the line, because I think we all carry some with us. We have to really unearth what our own stereotypes are. And, the thing about implicit biases and stereotypes is that we have them about ourselves too, And so you got to acknowledge that piece of it too, and then be ready to challenge it. And you also have to, once you identify what your biases are, you have to replace them with things that are more inclusive, with things that go against what those stereotypes and bias are. And you have to do that before you act on the prejudice, So, and some of it is simple things like changing your language. You have to think about like, what does our language say? When we have devil foods cake, which is chocolate, and angel food cake, which is white. You know, what does it say when you are the black sheep of the family, or you are as pure as the driven snow?
Mhm.
So, you know, we have to, you know, just take a look at those things, and those things, how they work their way into our psyches and into our minds, and think about our children and how they interpret that. So I immediately think of the doll experiment, where they have the children looking at a black doll and a white doll and talking about which one is good and which one is bad. And so, you know, we have to recognize that we have some internalized oppression, and then that comes from some of the stereotypes that we have taken on ourselves. And then other people also have some of those things. We have to know what they are and be ready to address them and crush them out of our systems. So I'll stop there.
Mhm. Yes, I think the language piece, I'm taking that one and I'm going to be thinking about it. I think for me, I was thinking about a couple of things. I think like it doesn't feel like a checklist type of thing. Like it feels like it has to be like an ongoing process. And I think for white people, you know, given historical policies of redlining or housing discrimination, like a lot of us grow up in communities that are white. And I think developing some consciousness around what have we been ingesting, and like what is the culture that we have been living in, and the resulting, you know, dynamics of privilege and power, and really taking time to unlearn racism and racist
Mhm.
behavior, because they are violent and harmful. And I say developing consciousness because I think oftentimes for white people, there's a journey of gaining consciousness of this is racist and here's why. And I think it's really, you know, a personal practice where you can, you know, learn about racist history or policies, you know, reading stories or experiences of people of color, developing like actual skills
Mhm.
around recognizing biases, and for us as white people, really challenging our emotional responses in racially stressful situations, because I think, you know, the feelings of guilt for white people are real, and so like really begin to work through and examine, you know, the areas of guilt or anger or frustration that might arise, when we are understand or beginning to understand that we're experiencing privilege, and also recognizing, you know, that there can be joy and connection to others when you're acting in protest or trying to combat racism. Um,
Mhm.
there's this really, Jay Smooth, who's like a cultural critic, had a TED talk back in, that was a while ago, but I think it's really a really great TED talk where, he's multiracial, but he talks about teeth brushing, as like an anti-racism. Like you wouldn't get up in the morning without brushing your teeth.
Uh-huh.
And so it has to be like a daily practice. You know, dentists often recommend that you do it twice a day. And I think oftentimes for white people too, like you might get food stuck in your teeth. And somebody might say, hey, I see some food stuck in your teeth. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you are a terrible white person, but you just got some racist stuff stuck in your teeth and you need to brush your teeth and get it out. And that has to be a daily and intentional practice. And I think like somehow that imagery for me like really hits home of the fact that it's not this like good, bad binary of like, I'm not a good white person or I'm not a bad white person. Racism exists, and I have been taking that in, and part of the anti-racism commitment is fighting it wherever I see, and part of that is brushing my teeth every day.
Mm. I like
Mhm. I just got so excited because when I first saw that video as well, I was like mind blown because it really gave a beautiful analogy of how it has to be that constant work. It has to be the daily work of breaking down those implicit biases. And I love, Dr. Allen, how you approached it and said, it's not just about acknowledging or the awareness that the biases are there, but actually doing the work to replace them with attitudes, behaviors, and actions that are more inclusive. Right. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Definitely, I've been bringing some of that brushing your teeth analogy into some of our training sessions. So I'm so glad that came into our conversation.
Can I add something to that? I think that because you asked a question earlier, we kind of moved past it. You asked us about what, at Penn, what does it look like and what could you do? And so I was thinking about that also, because I think that one of the things that we have to do is, in every space we're in, right? Look around the room and ask who's in the room, who's not in the room, whose voice is being heard, whose voice is not being heard, who's missing from the conversation and why, right? And then we need to find ways to bring those other voices, those other faces into the room. Now, I think, in some areas at Penn, we do a good job of that. I think we do a good job of having having different diverse faces in the room, diverse voices being heard. But we need to be aware where it's not happening, And the other thing is, and you said this earlier, you're like, nobody can speak for all the Black people. Nobody can speak for all the white people. But there has to be some acknowledgement and recognition of their voices in the room, So maybe it's that, like, joining an organization like WECARE, where you can, begin to learn some things that you can do and acknowledge what needs to happen. Coming to programs like this one, right? Where you can hear different voices. Having programs like this one yourself, having them within your department, having some real honest discussions within your department about what's happening, or, some of the things. Join an organization, And again, and we keep saying this, but be willing to have that thing in your teeth. It doesn't make you a bad person. Somebody's just going to tell you, you got something there, take it out. So I think, it's important that we do that. Important that we ask the questions about why the voices aren't there, why the people aren't there. And then the follow-up question is, how do we bring them? How do we get them in the room?
Yeah, I really appreciate you readdressing that question of what does the white allyship look like at Penn? And you provided some amazing examples of what folks can do and how they can get more involved, which is an excellent segue into our final question before we turn it over to our audience to pose some more questions. How can we continue to encourage the Penn community to embrace allyship and anti-racism? And why don't we have Elizabeth, you kick us off, and Dr. Allen, you close us out.
Yeah, I was thinking about two things that come to mind. And the first one actually came up in the discussion that was hosted. Valerie, I think you had the opening between Dr. Henry Lewis Taylor and Kenyanya Yamada Taylor, When the Marches End, Are We For Real This Time? And Dr. Henry Lewis Taylor talked about institutions having this like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde persona, which I thought was so compelling. Like on one hand, like, and the conversation of Penn, like how can we continue to develop and nurture a community that is empathetic, anti-racist, and really committed to social change? And that being an institution of higher education, how can we be a site for social change, and that being one side, and then this other side, being detrimental to communities, prioritizing profit over people, individualization, self-preservation, and self-interest being at the center. And like, how can we truly like be that first one, and really imagine, like have institutions of higher education be a place of imagining how can we center anti-racism? So that was one piece. And then this other piece, I'm reading Rachel Ricketts' book called Do Better, Spiritual Activism for Fighting and Healing from White Supremacy, which is a gut puncher for any cisgendered white women, but I highly recommend it. And she talks about like internal and external allyship, which I thought was a really interesting framework. And so like internally, for the white people that are in the audience, I think, you can join WECARE. We have a listserv where we send out resources. We will be partnering with Training for Change, which is a West Philly group that has been doing work for years to host Whites Confronting Racism trainings. And I think one thing that my actually small WeCare discussion group is doing is looking at Tema Oku's and Kenneth Jones' white supremacy culture. And it lists characteristics of white supremacy culture that show up in organizations, right? Culture is so powerful and it's present in every single thing that we do because it's so interwoven into our society, and thinking about how those characteristics are damaging because they're just used as norms without being proactively named or chosen, and that it promotes white supremacy thinking, and it's damaging to everybody, and that even organizations led by people of color can have and embrace these characteristics. And so I think that's like one thing that I've been really thinking about is like, what if we like took that and like really tried to interrogate what does that look like within our own organizational systems. But I like want to caution us at Penn too, because like I think intellectuals and academics can employ this like patronizing rhetoric around like racial justice and overvalue the knowledge and kind of intellectualizing things. And so I just want to caution us to do that it's like not about like really unlearning oppression, like how do we like smash it out of existence. So that was like an internal thing that I was thinking about. And externally, like how do we leverage resources and material support to further liberation struggles? What does it mean to, address harm when it happens, support, queer and trans-led Black-owned businesses in Philadelphia? If we're catering an event, what does that look like? Advocating for defunding and abolishing the police and prison industrial complex, reinvesting funds in Black communities, which I think includes paying pilots. So I'm going to stop there.
Wow. So it's hard for me to talk about this without talking about where we sit. And I'm talking about where Penn sits. I grew up in West Philadelphia. I grew up at 50th and Locust. And at this point, we're up beyond 40th at this point at the university. And even though my mother worked at the university, it never crossed my mind that I could go there, right? If you talk to and look at the schools that the feeder schools, high schools, middle schools, elementary schools that are surrounding us and how poorly they are performing, it just always, it's such a juxtaposition to be this wonderful Ivy League institution who's #1 in so many areas, but to have these schools around you that are failing, right? So, in terms of what are some things that we can do at Penn, I think we have to, and we do some of this, and don't get me wrong, because I don't want it to sound like we're not doing things. The Graduate School of Education has this computer system. I wish I could think of the name of it, and if somebody knows it, put it in the system where they can kind of hotspot where Penn is reaching out into the community and what they're doing. But there is always more that needs to be done. And until our schools in West Philadelphia are achieving at the same rate as Central, Girls High, GAMP, and the other schools that, thank you, Philly Map put it, phillymap.gsc.upenn.edu, where they have everything that we're doing. We've got to continue to do more. The other thing that often comes up is that there aren't Black and brown people in the pipelines for leadership positions, right? And so when there are leadership positions that open, if you are involved in the hiring process, if you can influence what that pool looks like, you want to make sure that pool has a diverse list of qualified candidates. And there are qualified candidates that are Black. There are qualified candidates that are women. There are qualified candidates that are brown. We have to make sure that they're included in the pool. And some of it has to do with the algorithm that's used to judge your resume, right? I just figured that out just recently. Because it's, you know, it's still kind of new, but if your resume and your transcript and your application don't fit a certain algorithm, it drops your numbers down. And then as a hiring officer, I'm not looking at anybody who's below 90 when I have 100 people who are 90. So we have to make sure that, that these algorithms allow for the inclusion of Black and brown people in the pipeline for leadership positions. The other thing is that what happens a lot of times is we have Black people who are in positions and watch their white colleagues get promoted and get other opportunities that they don't get. As an ally, you got to be able to say, wait a minute, you know, we need to take a look at why, again, why is that happening? Who's in the room? Who's making the decision? And I look at sometimes some of the missteps that happen when you see them on commercials and stuff, and you think to yourself, did they have any Black person in that room when they put that commercial together? Because if they did, somebody should have said something, right? So we need to make sure that that doesn't happen when decisions are being made, when things are being put out, that it, you know, that there are some other eyes that are looking at it so we can make sure that it's inclusive. And I think that, again, programs like these, you know, we gotta keep having these conversations. We have got to communicate with each other. We've got to take the risk. You got to join organizations where everybody in the room doesn't look like you, so that you can learn from each other and so that you can grow together, so that you can understand each other. That's the only way that we're going to be able to begin to do this. And also,
yeah, keep going.
I'm just going to say the other thing is that, you know, at some point we do have to talk about reparations, and we do have to talk about pilots. And I think those are other conversations that we have got to have, but I don't think we should have them right now.
Listen, there's so much that could have this conversation going on for hours on hours, which is a reminder that it's not just a one-off thing, right? It's something that we have to consistently do. And each of us has to find here at Penn, where are those ways in which we can start to dismantle the white supremacy that we even face here in our institution. As great and diverse as it is, there is still so much work that can be done. So thank you, thank you, thank you. With that, we want to lean into some of the questions that have popped up in our chat. One of which, Elizabeth, if you could please share that book that you were mentioning about internal versus external racism. If you could drop the name in the chat, so folks are looking for that. But you got it right there. That's fantastic. We know you really are reading it. See that? That's not passive activism, right?
That was not me signaling that I'm a good white person.
Well, speaking of that, our first question from the chat comes in: how can we confront white folks with a white savior complex and whose activism is performative? For example, white people who give lip service to combating racism, but only do so because of their feelings of guilt or desire to be acknowledged and praised. Look at that, nice segues.
I love what Erin put in the chat, which you can't be doing things for good ally cookies. That's not why you should be doing the things. And some of that comes with understanding and being able to listen and hear. And I think that, you know, we got to be able to confront people and to say to people, wait a minute, we don't need you to come in and fix this for us. We need you to come in and fix this with us, right? And I talked about that a little earlier, about it's not about a paternalistic thing where this is the savior coming to lead us to the promised land. We want you to join with us arm in arm and walk across that bridge together. You know, one of the things that, they talk about is Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, right? Well, we all know that that's not the whole truth. There were a whole lot of slaves that were fighting and pushing and not allowing things to happen. You can't do it for somebody. You got to do it with them. And we got to make sure that everybody understands that. And again, sometimes it's going to take the white person confronting the other white person.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think that was great.
All right, we'll take that. I think you also started to bring forward this notion, and I invite folks to continue putting questions into the Q&A of taking the personal ownership and the personal responsibility that comes along with dismantling so many of these systems, right? You started to hint at earlier this notion of how do we address those personal prejudices? It has to start here. It has to start at this level. It's not about always waiting for folks to do things at the macro level. Oh, we need the president to do this. We need the government to do this. It has to start here. It starts in the everyday interactions that we are having and in the communities that we are all in, right? I've been having so many conversations where folks are talking about the system is doing that. The system is this, the system. Yes, we know the system has a lot of work to do, but please, please never ever forget you are the system.
Right.
You as an individual person make up these systems that we are often talking about. So why not take the ownership and the power that you hold to make and see the changes that you want to see in our world today, right? So important.
Can I just add one other thing? So I talked about acknowledging that there are differences and being and embracing that those are differences. I think that I had an opportunity to have my daughter home for the first time in a number of years, and she's in theater. And she was talking about, and it was really helpful for me, she was talking about casting and the difference between colorblind casting and color conscious casting. And so when we look at our differences, we don't want to be colorblind. I want you to see me as a Black woman. I am proud to be a Black woman. I want to see you as a white woman. You should be proud to be a white woman. But I want us to be conscious of what those things mean and how they play out in the world. So we can't be colorblind. We have to be color conscious.
Yeah. It reminds me of Ijeoma Olu's book, and she writes that something about I'm going to butcher this quote, but this is the essence, that the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. That part of it is the commitment to fighting racism wherever you find it, which is on the macro level in the system, but it's also for white people individually in ourselves.
Yeah, it goes back to that notion of what you were mentioning earlier in terms of acknowledging that, yes, I hold these biases. Yes, I may engage in racist ways, right? But it's something that I've also encouraging folks when we are addressing those moments is to avoid labeling. Because as you started to talk about earlier, is that our emotions run high as soon as we are labeled something. Oh, you're a racist. Oh, of course not. No, I'm not. Oh, no, my best friend is Black. I can't be racist, right? It's acknowledging that it's not about the character of who you are. It's what you're doing. It's the actions and the engagements that you're having that are still coming from spaces of racist ideology, right? And again, recognizing that none of us in this country are immune to the symptoms of racism, that the disease of racism that our country is embedded in. We do have another question in the Q&A. Can you share some of those links to how folks can sign up for some of these organizations, either how folks can get more involved with the AARC or how folks can continue to get involved with WECARE? So we'll see some of those links popping up there. So we are edging closer and closer to wrapping up. So I want to give a moment to both Val and Elizabeth, if you have any final words for our audience as we wrap up today.
When I did my dissertation, I used a play, and it was called Journey of a Gun. And this is not about gun, but the last lines of the show were, can we talk? Can we talk? and keep talking. And that's what I think we have to do.
I definitely agree. And I think like one thing that I want to offer to the white people that are listening in is that like I think it's important to develop a supportive network of other people that hold you accountable, like true and honest accountability partners that don't pat you on the back, that they challenge you, that they push you, that it's not a self-congratulatory or like an apathetic. It's an actual check and balance to challenge the ways to challenge our white centering behaviors or white dominance or white fragility. And I think that is something for me that has helped in my anti-racist journey.
Yes, being able to challenge ourselves, challenge each other, and hold each other accountable. So important. Yeah, honestly, all of this, the entire time we've been in conversation today, I've been thinking about Amanda Gorman. Amanda Gorman and her poem for the inauguration, The Hill We Climb. And the final line, which I will leave for our audience, is, "For there is light, if only you are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it." So we have to continue to be that light that we wish to see in our world. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Aaron Cross, director of the LGBT Center and another co-founder of WECARE, to close us out today.
Thanks so much, Malik, Val, Elizabeth. Wow. I'm going to end with wow, but I'm going to say a little more after the wow. You all were amazing and really brought up so many things that all of us on this call can use and continue to think about on so many levels. I want to thank AARC in particular, Colleen and Darren as well, for kicking this off and working with WeCare. This is our first public event. We have been doing small discussion groups with white people to address our racism and work so that we can be better accomplices. So many things were said that I can't just sum it all up. I don't think you can do that. Yes, so many gems. Thank you, Cindy. That sounds right. But I'm thinking about talking to each other and how important that is. And I'm also thinking about John Lewis, who I think about a lot, that Val Dorsey mentioned about good trouble. It's okay to make trouble, people. It's okay to make trouble. As long as it's good trouble. Are you doing it for the right reasons? White people, are you doing it for those allied cookies? Are you doing it to really get more voices at the table? And are you doing it not for yourself, but really for the communities you think you're being an ally to? You really have to think that through. And it's hard because, as Elizabeth said, whiteness is centered. And now I want to say something to the white people in particular. All this is a process. Please know, as Elizabeth said earlier, all of us are on this journey. There's no end to it. We're continuing to learn. It's important to look at ourselves and our internalized issues, to unlearn a lot of what is happening, and then act, because our silence is complicity. So if you don't say something, people are going to think you agree with what's going on, even if it's wrong. And then, as Val said, we have to do with, not for. Do with, not for. A lot of us were raised to see help as doing something for somebody. Help can be many different things and come in many different packages. And in this case, with is the kind of help folks need. And I knew Malik was going to use Amanda Gorman, but something that was said earlier in this conversation strikes the same tone. So I'm going to leave with that. It is radical love that was talked about earlier. I think to truly work on our internal issues and work with people, we have to radically love ourselves and radically love each other. So radical love, it's a daily doing. And I'd like us all to go and do. So thank you so much for joining us for this program. We are recording it, so it will be available. Thank you.
Thank you.